Welcome to Shine Your Light,
a one-on-one show where we provide an individual with a platform to tell their truth.
They can talk about what they've been through and what they learned.
Or they can educate us about their area of expertise.
Sometimes you get Aaron, and sometimes you get Tim.
But you always get to be your own light.
This week, we're joined by the radiant Nicholas Brumfield.
My name is Nicholas Brumfield. I have a master's in Arab studies from Georgetown University and have been professionally following Middle East politics for the last 5 years. And if you include my academic career, at least the last 10 years, I've been an activist and sort of scholar interested in following the Israel-Palestine conflict since about 2011.
Thank you for introducing yourself, and thank you for coming on the podcast. Where has this Israel-Palestine conflict started? I hear it's like thousands of years old. They've been fighting forever. But in one of our brainstorm sessions, you said the modern Israel-Palestine conflict is only about 100 years old.
This is an important misconception that I think is important to get out of the way right off the bat. Most people sort of look at Israel-Palestine as this great religious conflict. There's always been conflict in the Middle East. There will always be conflict in the Middle East. That's not really the case with regards to this. The Israel-Palestine conflict can really be dated back to the late 19th century. It's also important to sort of note that, it's always envisaged in religious terms, in terms of, religious sort of groups fighting one another, Muslims versus Jews or Christians, et cetera. And that's really not the case either. Really, the best analogy to what is going on in Israel-Palestine right now, I think, is the U.S. colonization of America. So essentially what happened was in the 19th century, you had a bunch of different things going on in Europe. You had nationalism, this idea that people belong to nation states and that they should exist in countries that are sort of their nation. So you had this idea that French people should live in France and German people should live in Germany and British people should live in Britain. So you had this sort of idea starting with the French Revolution in the late 1700s and throughout the 19th century that this is the way that we need to organize society. You also had just a massive uptick in anti-Semitism in Western Europe. I mean, if you've seen Fiddler on the Roof, this is sort of, it gets at this. You had pogroms, you just had constant attacks against European Jews. It was horrible. And so what came out of that, these two things, nationalism and anti-Semitism, was what we know as the Zionist movement or Zionism. This is the idea of a Jewish nationalism. This was started by Theodor Herzl, who is he's from Austria. He's an Austrian Jew. He's a journalist. This idea that the Jews, like everybody else in Europe, need a state. They need their own country. And so they were currently in diaspora. They were sort of spread out all over, and they were very vulnerable to anti-Semitism and the anti-Semitic attacks. And so what you got from the Zionist movement was this idea that we need to go back to Palestine. We need to go back to our homeland in Israel and set up a state where we can protect ourselves and control our own destiny. And so that's sort of the Zionist movement. And what you saw from that starting in the late 1800s, going into the early 1900s, was European Jews in particular going back in very large droves. First as immigrants. There's this sort of idea that Jews were never welcome in Palestine. They were. There were actually indigenous. There are Jews indigenous to Palestine. There are Jews indigenous to the Middle East. They spoke, Arabic, and so they were sort of integrated. But at the same time, you also had this large influx of European Jews who were ethnically and culturally very distinct from this area coming to the area first as immigrants, but then increasingly, as they sort of got more strength, setting up their institutions to sort of make their own state, separate from the society that was existing there currently. And they did this with the sponsorship of, in particular, Britain. So in 1917, Britain issued the Balfour Declaration, which was essentially, a public statement of Britain's support for a Jewish homeland in Palestine. And following the First World War, Britain got control of what is now Israel-Palestine. And they used their sort of control of Palestine to more or less support the Zionist movement while suppressing any Palestinian attempts to sort of set up their own sort of national institutions, sort of under this understanding that there would be a Jewish state in Palestine. So fast forward, through a lot of stuff, and this is a very complex subject. I don't want to, there was a lot of very horrific violence on both sides throughout the 1920s and 30s, and I don't want to sort of overstep that. But fast forward to 1947-48, which was when it was after World War II. Everybody was very, very tired. Everybody was very exhausted. Britain didn't have money or troops to sort of to secure Israel-Palestine, and they withdrew. And they're like, fuck it. You guys do you and you. And this is sort of the beginning of the breaking a part, I think, of the main narratives that you're seeing today. Israelis see the 1948 war, the first sort of Palestinian-Israeli war, the first Arab-Israeli war, as their war of independence. This is right after the Holocaust in Europe, that genocide of 6 million Jews by Nazi Germany, and the trauma that really kind of dissipated any opposition to Zionism from within the Jewish movement, because even though there were a lot of opponents before, the Holocaust really sort of made that sort of go away. There was this understanding and this belief that the Jews need their own state in order to make sure this doesn't happen again. And so it's important to understand that, because discussions around what's going on with Hamas right now, what's going around along with Palestinian movements, is viewed in the prism of an existential threat for Israelis. So that's very important. The Holocaust also really sort of got rid of any international opposition to that. The British were initially opposed to setting up the state the way that the Israelis sort of wanted it. Following this sort of massive Zionist influx of Jews fleeing Europe, you really did have a surge in sort of support. And so you saw this formation of two groups in Israel-Palestine, sort of the Yishuv, or the Jewish community, and then sort of the Palestinians who were more fragmented, in part due to the British government actually sort of attacking them and trying to prevent them from setting up national institutions. Palestinians view it as the Nakba, or the catastrophe. So during the course of the first Arab-Israeli war, in which other sort of countries, Arab countries bordering what is now Israel-Palestine, were involved sort of on the Palestinian side, but the Israelis were also. So during the course of that war, Israel sort of got its modern-day borders. They secured the land that they were doing then. But at the same time, because there weren't enough Jewish Israelis within those borders to secure a democratic majority, if they ever needed a democratic majority, what you did see the Zionist leadership do was essentially ethnically cleanse 750,000 Palestinians from those territories under the control. Gaza and the West Bank were not sort of included in those boundaries. Those were for the West Bank went to Jordan for a little while. It wasn't internationally recognized. Now Gaza went to Egypt. Essentially, the long and short is, within the territories of modern-day Israel, you saw 750,000 Palestinians get ethnically cleansed. You have a question.
It sounds like the origin of this was the nationalist movement of people need to have their own countries, and kind of forced upon the Jewish people, like, you have to go back to your country, which is Israel-Palestine. And so at first they left as refugees because they were told they needed to leave because they were under attack. And then increasingly that just became the norm of, like, hey, if you're Jewish, you should live back where you came from.
So it was a very complex dynamic. So I don't think any European country was saying you have to go back.
But it was just a change in mindset.
Yes. But it's important to note that actually a lot of Jews during this time were anti-Zionist. They did not believe in the return to Israel, in part because, I really think this is important to stress to viewers. This is like the Europeans coming from Europe to the north, to sort of eastern United States, killing sort of Indians, taking the land.
Colonialization.
Yes. And then continuing to do that.
So once they kind of were established in Israel, they had a war, they established their borders. Gaza went to Egypt, the West Bank went to Jordan.
Mm-hmm.
And in order to say this is ours, because they didn't have a majority, they killed the indigenous population, which was 750,000.
Killed it and ethnically cleansed,
What percent of the population was that? Because I don't know.
To be honest, I don't remember off the top of my head. I could look it up for you. We're talking,
was it like half?
We're talking in the low millions. The entire sort of the whole shebang, both Israelis and Palestinians at this time, were in the low mill. We're talking like 5 million people.
So they did do the America thing where they went in and just ethnically cleansed, so they would have majority and no one could tell them otherwise.
Yeah. That's the long and short of it.
10-4, I feel like I'm tracking on this. What happened next?
So the next sort of important, so it's important to note that the West Bank and Gaza were not included in Israel proper at the time. Israeli leadership was actually very opposed to getting these, because these territories have a lot of Palestinian people. And if they got them, then they couldn't say that Israel was a Jewish democratic state. The early sort of Zionist leadership was very sort of social democratic. They considered themselves socialists. They wanted to have a Jewish state where they didn't have to impose apartheid and all this sort of stuff. And they thought that if you were to ever actually get the West Bank and Gaza, that it would be a disaster because it would destroy Israel as they envisioned it as this socialist beacon of democracy, and et cetera. So what you saw throughout the 1940s and 50s and 60s were a variety of wars between Israel and neighboring Arab states. There was one in 1956 that Israel, Britain, and the UK sort of did against Egypt. But really the big one, and the one that we talk about now, is 1967. So this is called the Six-Day War. It's known as the Nakba for Palestinians, which means, I believe, the defeat or something like this. So essentially what happened, without getting into who started what or whatever, because, Egypt blockaded the Straits of Tiran for Israel. Israel then launched a preemptive strike against Egypt and launched this massive thing. The long and short of it is, at the end of that, Israel had both the West Bank and Gaza. They controlled it. They took that territory. And that's when what we say is the occupation, the Israeli occupation of Palestine began. The residents of these areas were not incorporated as Israeli citizens. They were not given rights or anything. These are, under international law, occupied territories under war, under the Fourth Geneva Convention. A lot of people saying right now, Palestine has been occupied for 56 years, et cetera, et cetera. That's when that started. And so what you saw throughout the 1970s, 80s, and 90s to a certain extent was conflict, attempts at compromise. People will remember there was the first Intifada in 1987 to 1992, 93, when Palestinians, a largely nonviolent Palestinian resistance, broke out to try to break the occupation. This culminated in sort of pressure on Israeli leadership to do what we know as the Oslo Accords, which was sort of signed in 1993. It's that picture of Yasser Arafat and the Israeli prime minister shaking hands with Bill Clinton that everyone sees when they talk about the Israeli-Palestine conflict. This set up the goal of the Israel-Palestine conflict, or the resolution, as what we call the two-state solution. This idea that the Palestinians will get a state in the West Bank and Gaza, and the Israelis will get the state within the borders of 1948 Israel. That didn't really do anything. It set up some Palestinian institutions, but ultimately, and there was a field peace talks in 2000 that the Israelis blamed the Palestinians blamed the Israelis, but it did not stop the occupation. The occupation continued, and what we've seen over the course of the last 30 years, essentially the entirety of my lifetime, is Israel continuing to encroach settlements into the West Bank. When we talk about the illegal Israeli settlements, what we're talking about is Israelis who are often very far-right, very religious, kind of messianic people who believe that all of Israel belongs to them, and as such, they should get all of the land. This is very different from what the early Zionist leadership was like, hey, we want, because most of the early Zionists were actually atheists. They were like, let's just set up a nice little socialist democratic thing. But the far right people that we've seen grow over the course of the last, several decades are very much like, this is all ours. And so what you've seen them is, with support from the Israeli Defense Forces and the Israeli government, various sort of far right settlers move into the West Bank to set up settlements on what is Palestinian land. And so this has continued to increase. Israel controls essentially all of the roads, everything within the West Bank. If a Palestinian wants to move from point A to point B, they will most likely have to go through an Israeli military checkpoint. There are separate roads for the settlers versus the Palestinians. The Palestinians don't really control. There's a Palestinian Authority, but at this point, it's largely seen as kind of a collaborationist government with the Israeli security forces that has no actual real power. So we saw that continue throughout the late 1990s and early 2000s. There was also the second Intifada. Intifada, which is it's a scary word for a lot of Americans, I think. Intifada literally just means, in Arabic, uprising or throwing off. So for Palestinians, this is them attempting—
like a revolution.
Yes, or like a kind of a rebellion to try to throw off the occupation is how Palestinians sort of see this. We saw the second Intifada start in the 2000s, which got much more violent than the first Intifada. This is where you saw reports of Palestinian suicide bombers and all this sorts of stuff that, like attacks on civilians, very gruesome stuff. And a lot of Palestinians don't support these kinds of attacks. But, it was just to give you a sense that right after 9/11, the pressure cooker was up on everything. Israel was pushing into the West Bank. They were building the wall, which is very famous now, this wall separating Israel from the West Bank that also actually cuts off from some West Bank land to put it in Israel that a lot of Palestinians don't like. And so this was the second Intifada. This brings us to the final sort of major point. So that you have the 1948 war, which is the Nakba. You have the 1967 war, which is the beginning of the occupation. And then the last sort of major thing to understand what's been going on in Gaza right now is the blockade. So this started in 2007. What you saw was the United States, because it was really wanting to push democracy in the Middle East. This was when we were in Iraq and we were trying really hard to push, democracy for everybody in the Middle East. We pushed for elections in the Palestinian areas. Gaza, by a very narrow margin, like I forget the margin, but it wasn't like it was an overwhelming thing. It was like maybe 50, 55%. I can't remember the exact number. Elected Hamas as the sort of people to head them. Hamas actually started in the late 1980s. It hasn't been around for the entire conflict. It's a religious movement that sort of advocates for armed resistance to the Israeli occupation. As we saw this past week, it's committed some very grievous crimes, but like ultimately sort of its stated goal is the liberation of Palestine. But it's also, it's fair. People have singled out Hamas as very anti-Semitic, which if you look at its charter, I think it's very true, and very sort of scary. It's potentially genocidal, but ultimately, really, it grew out of the occupation, and it grew out of the sidelining of more secular factions like the Palestine Liberation Organization and Fatah that were not so genocidal and have in fact recognized Israel within its 1948 borders. What you saw beginning in the first Intifada was the growth of Hamas. And then also, Israeli leaders have come out, essentially, there's actually a report that's circulated in the last few days, essentially getting Benjamin Netanyahu, who's been the prime minister of Israel at various times since 1995, is essentially saying that he supported Hamas. Like it was Israel kind of built up Hamas to marginalize the other Palestinian factions so that they can say we have nobody who's willing to talk to us. And so what we saw in 2005, 2006 was the Palestinians in Gaza elected Hamas as their kind of the leaders. And Israel didn't like this. And so they enacted what we call the blockade. So Israel has even though Israel disengaged, there used to be settlements in Gaza, they disengaged in 2005, I believe. Israel has complete control over all land, sea, and air traffic going into Gaza. They control, how much food can go in, how much fuel can go in. You're seeing them use this past week when they've put on an entire blockade of all food, fuel, and electricity and water to Gaza. So so the occupation is still there, even though they pulled out. But that is when the blockade is happening. So you're seeing a lot of people call for the end to the blockade. And that's what they mean is a lifting of Israeli control of that. This brings us to the last 15 years, which, I think we can kind of skip over a lot of it, to be honest, because it's been more or less the same. There have been about 4 wars between Israel and Gaza about every 3 or 4 years. Either Hamas will launch a rocket and Israel will just bomb the shit out of Gaza, or Israel will bomb the shit out of Gaza and Hamas will launch some rockets. But essentially in 2008, 2009, 2014, 2018, 2019, that 2018, 2019 wasn't a war. 2021, there was another war. The Israeli leadership call it mowing the grass. It's more or less kind of like being like, we've sort of contained them. We're not actually going to negotiate with them. So about once every couple of years, maybe if there's an election cycle that we need bailed out on, maybe we'll start a war with Hamas to be like, we're protecting Israel. And and we'll just bomb the fuck out of Gaza. And so the
last one does.
Yeah. And the last major one that they did was back in 2014, when I believe over 2,000 Palestinians were killed and sort of leveled it. That was the last time that Israel attempted to go into Gaza. Actually with ground troops, and it didn't go very well for them. The last couple of years have been very, very important because we've seen this is the first time in the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that the far, far right people have gotten into power. In the last year and a half, these settlers that we sort of talked about going into the West Bank and sort of saying all of this is ours. They were marginalized in governments. You had center-right governments under Benjamin Netanyahu, which were kind of favorable to them, but they were kind of in the driver's seat. But in order for this most recent Israeli government to form, they needed the support of these really, really radical people that have openly said, essentially, we're going to kill all the Palestinians and take the land. That's their stated policy. And so over the course of the last year and a half, after this far-right government in Israel came to power, we've seen intensification of attempts to take control of what is Palestinian land. You're seeing increased settler attacks, pogroms. And I know people don't like to use that word for Palestinians, but you've had sort of Jewish humanitarian organizations or human rights organizations come out and call these pogroms, where you have state-supported settlers essentially attacking and trying to expel or kill Palestinians from land so that they can take it. The last several months, over 200 Palestinians have been killed this is before the war, before everything that's happening. What we've seen over the course of the last couple of months, over 200 Palestinians. Over the last 2.5 years, 600 Palestinians have been killed, either by Israeli security forces or by Israeli settlers in the West Bank in particular. And so that kind of brings us to this sort of idea that has emerged over the last 10 years or so, is that the two-state solution is dead. That ultimately the Israelis have moved so deep into the West Bank that it will be impossible to get them out. There is not going to be two territorially contiguous states to sort of have a two-state solution. And so what a lot of people are pushing for is a one-state solution now, which is you get everybody in one state, you give all of them equal rights, everybody has a democratic voice, and maybe, definitely kind of work towards trying to end the conflict that way rather than sort of partitioning them into two separate states. That's become increasingly prominent on sort of within human rights discourse because, within the last couple of years, several human rights organizations, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and a lot of Jewish Israeli human rights organizations have increasingly called what we're seeing in Israel-Palestine apartheid, similar to what we saw with regards to whites and black South Africans in South Africa until 1990. It's that you effectively have one state, but there are 2 or 3 different classes of citizens, with Israelis at the top, Arab citizens or Palestinian citizens of Israel, which they make up about 20% of the population within 1948 Israel, and then the Palestinians in the occupied territories, each sort of occupying tiers of citizenship, with the folks in the occupied territories effectively having no rights. Yeah. So the push is to try to get them the sort of same rights. At the same time, what we've seen over the course of the last several years is and this is important to American listeners, is a U.S. push to effectively kind of cement this sort of situation through normalization deals between Israel and various Arab states. We saw under the Trump administration what they call the Abraham Accords. It started with a normalization deal between the United Arab Emirates and Israel. Most of the Arab states following the 1948 war did not recognize Israel to sort of support the Palestinian cause, but we've seen increasingly with U.S. pressure, various Arab states recognizing Israel. Egypt did it as part of the Camp David Accords in 1979. Jordan did it as part of the Wadi Araba Treaty in 1994. And so what we're seeing in the last couple of years is another push to normalize relations between Israel and the Arab states. So we had the United Arab Emirates, we had Morocco, and we had, I believe, Sudan under the Trump administration. And the Biden administration has pushed very, very hard, I think, in the lead up to the 2024 election to try to normalize Saudi relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia. The fear among the Palestinians is effectively what the United States is trying to do is make it so that the Palestinians can get no support and marginalize them and just not talk about it. And so that Israel can sort of exist within the Middle East without having to really give any concessions to the Palestinians, while the United States is more or less underwriting this with various deals and talk. I mean, there's talk, and there's even talk now of the United States giving Saudi Arabia a defense treaty, giving them an alliance with Saudi Arabia between the United States that we will come in and defend them if they are ever attacked. This is not something we give out to most people. We've only ever given that out to 3 separate countries separate from NATO. We have NATO, which is our big alliance in the North Atlantic. We've only ever given it out to 3 countries, all of them in East Asia: Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea. Those are the only countries that have that because of our security sort of interest in East Asia. We've never given it out, not even to Israel. But Saudi Arabia is wanting this because they're afraid of Iran, that gets into another thing.
Yeah.
So that is the background to what we saw over the course of the last week, and we can start talking about the events of this last week. But I do think it is important to get a lot of that sort of in as background, because it's not, as many people have been saying this past week, history didn't begin on October 7th. And understanding that history is really, really vital to being able to find a way out of this.
That makes sense. Thank you for aggressively charging through that. I think you got through About 80 years of very complex history in like 20 minutes. So bravo Zulu on you.
Thank you.
That's very impressive. So it sounds like the Israeli state kind of has this concept of manifest destiny that the US is supporting, and they're trying to continue to do the America thing of like push the local population into such a marginalized community that they have no voice, as America did with the Native Americans. And we are making this rule into law by having all the countries around endorsing and saying, yes, Israel is what it is.
Yeah.
So I'm pretty bummed out about that.
Yeah.
I think everyone should have a free Tibet flag. Now, I also think that everyone should have a maybe like Palestinians should be allowed to have lives.
Yeah.
Flag. So please tell us your thoughts on what everyone's seeing in the news now. Thank you for catching us up on the history, but you said history didn't start October 7th. What did start October 7th?
So this most recent sort of round of really, really, really brutal and horrible violence that is just, started on October 7th when Hamas, which is normally kind of, Hamas and Israel have a symbiotic relationship where they're kind of like, Hamas will fire off a couple missiles, Israel will bomb the hell out of Gaza, but they kind of understood one another. It's like, okay, they let us kind of rule Gaza and Israel. Yeah, anyway, they had a symbiotic relationship. That was fundamentally broken on October 7th when Hamas, with over 1,000 sort of Hamas sort of aligned commandos, broke out of Gaza. They broke out of the Gaza perimeter fence. They had people paragliding to land in southern Israel, and attacked Israel in a really brutal way. And I think it's important to state, because I am very pro-Palestinian. I'm very I want people to understand Palestine, but I also do think we need to take time to sort of process what happened with regards to the Hamas attacks, which were horrific. What you saw was Hamas did attack military targets. So they killed about 250 or 200 Israeli military personnel, which, that's under the laws of war, under the laws of the Geneva Conventions. That's totally, that's war.
That's good to go. Yeah.
But that's war. Yeah. But in addition to that, they killed about 1,200 Israeli civilians in very, very brutal, horrific war crimes. It's important to call that out. They were sort of, going. Some of them were going house to house, massacring people. Some of them were, Then they took hostages. This is the largest
giant rave they attacked.
Yes, yeah, they attacked a music festival, which was only about 3 miles away, or 3 kilometers or 3 miles away from the Gaza border fence, which is, it's really just the image of that is just very. It's a weird juxtaposition. You have Gaza on one side, which is sort of blockaded, and then you have that, and that's not to justify, but it's like, so they broke over the fence and they massacred 260 Israelis at that. And so this is the largest loss of life for Israel during the entire course of its existence. This is the first time that an Arab army, quote unquote, or an Arab armed group has been able to occupy Israeli land for any amount of time. It's a massive sort of psychological trauma for Israelis. It's worth noting, though, as many people have called it Israel's 9/11. It's really interesting to look at how they've responded to it, though. In the U.S., 9/11 was a rally around the flag moment, completely destroy all critics of the Bush administration. There was, let's invade Iraq, even though there was no reason to invade Iraq. What you're seeing in Israel is very interesting because something like 90% of Israelis have held the Benjamin Netanyahu government, the far-right government, responsible for this. It's also worth noting that this comes in the context of about a year and a half of Israeli pro-democratic protests against the Netanyahu government, which is attempting to do a judicial overhaul to limit the Israeli judiciary's power to constrain the Netanyahu government, which has a lot of implications for both the occupation, but also the lives of ordinary Israelis. So anyway, so you have that. So you have this massive sort of psychological damage. Most Israelis actually hold Benjamin Netanyahu responsible, but the Netanyahu government feels that it needs to respond because Hamas also did take hostages. They did sort of take them to Gaza, something like 150, both civilian hostages and military prisoners of war. And so in response to this attack, Israel has unleashed an unprecedented assault on Gaza. We, as I've said, we've seen multiple wars where thousands of Palestinians have died. Palestinian civilians have died. Massive civilian casualty ratios. In 2014, something like for every one Israeli that died, 1,200 Palestinians have died. So what we're seeing here is unprecedented even for that. And so they are leveling Gaza. They are bombing the shit out of Gaza in preparation for what the Israeli government says is going to be a massive ground invasion of Gaza to essentially destroy Hamas.
Yeah, they said they want to change the reality for generations of Palestinians.
Yes,
which is pretty insane to say and not identify that organization as part of like Hydra.
Yeah, I mean, well, yeah. So what we've seen is this massive sort of bombardment. As of the last check, something like 2,200 Palestinians have been killed. They are targeting hospitals. They are targeting schools. Aid workers have been killed. U.S. has been really pretty full-throatedly in support of this. The Biden administration called any calls by progressives for a ceasefire as disgraceful and have more or less said that they back Israel to the hilt. We have deployed 2 of our 11 aircraft carriers. The U.S. only has 11 aircraft carriers to patrol the entire world. We have deployed 2 of them to the eastern Mediterranean to provide support for Israel in case Hezbollah, which is right across the border in Lebanon, or other sort of groups who have said that they're going to escalate if Israel goes in on the ground, to effectively provide cover for them. The 2 really important things for people to get, and this is why I went through all the history, because it's very important. This past weekend, Israel, in preparations for this ground invasion that they say is to take out Hamas, ordered the evacuation of 1.1 million Palestinians from North Gaza. So Gaza City, this is the most densely populated area of Gaza. It's like the metropolitan sort of center. They ordered the evacuation of 1.1 million Palestinians to the south of Gaza. This immediately raised concerns that they're going to try to ethnically cleanse at least that portion of Gaza. They're saying that this is for civilians. It's because we're going to attack and we want to protect civilians. But for Palestinians, this immediately raised that memory of 1948 and the Nakba, where very similar sort of orders were issued that like, oh, this is for your protection, just leave, you'll be able to come back. And then they were never able to come back. And you're seeing several Palestinians essentially say, we're not going to leave because this has happened to us before and we're not going to let it happen again. And we're going to die standing, is what one guy said. So that's sort of the major thing for me that I'm worried about, is that this ground invasion is going to be used as an excuse for ethnic cleansing, or even certain people within Israeli leadership have called for Palestinians to flee to Egypt, right across the border. So Egypt has a border crossing with the Gaza Strip,
which they've closed.
Yes, which they've closed. Well, Israel bombed the crossing 3 times, and Egypt has also closed it. But you're saying that you have some Israeli sort of folks in Israel saying, yeah, you guys need to go to Egypt to be safe. And you've had the Biden administration say we need a humanitarian corridor so that civilians will be able to go to Egypt, and sort of to Palestinians, this reads as a pretext to ethnic cleansing and that they're not going to be able to go back. One notable politics scholar, Mark Lynch, who is at George Washington University, he effectively said this call for humanitarian corridors is worse than doing nothing, because effectively what you're going to have, if it happens, and of course we have to recognize the humanitarian concerns for 2.2 million Palestinians, but essentially the way he games it's going to go out is you're going to have the humanitarian corridors. Israel's going to go in and do massive atrocities, and you're going to see all the Palestinians flee. They're going to push all of the Palestinians to Egypt and depopulate the Gaza Strip, and they're going to take it. Is the fear that is like the number, which would in fact be a genocide. And so people are throwing like they're like
that's the definition.
Yeah, destroying Gazans as a corporate entity by kicking them all out of Gaza. This is, and I've never used that word for Israeli attacks on Gaza because I know it sounds hyperbolic, but this is the level that we're at and the fear that we're at. So that's sort of my main concern right now. It's also worth noting, because all the focus is on Gaza, that settler attacks in the West Bank that we've talked about are continuing. As of the last count, so Israel has completely locked down the West Bank. They have control over all the roads and everything. They say Palestinians can't go from one place to another. At the same time, Israeli settlers are roving through the West Bank, killing Palestinians. As of last count, 54 Palestinians have been killed. 2 villages have been entirely depopulated. And so you are seeing what are in effect pogroms, because if the Israeli security forces can prevent the Palestinians from moving, they can prevent the settlers from moving. And so there's a lot of fear that, in addition to this fear of ethnic cleansing from Gaza, particularly if this humanitarian corridor ethnic cleansing thing works, that's a roadmap for the Israeli far right to do that in the West Bank. And so that's sort of where we're at. And then to push them over into Jordan, more or less, is sort of the fear. It's really, really fucking scary. It's the direst I've ever seen concern about Gaza. And I've been following this for 10, 15 years very closely.
And professionally, you've dedicated your life to it.
Yes. And so it's very, very scary. So that is what has happened over the course of the last couple of weeks. We can get into what can happen next and what we can do about it, I suppose.
Please continue.
Of course. Yeah. So what can happen next? There's a couple really nightmare scenarios that I want your listeners to be aware of that can happen next. One is this Israeli ground invasion that we've already talked about. This, regardless of Israeli intentions, even if they're just there to go after Hamas, this is going to cause massive devastation. Like we're talking thousands of Palestinians have already been killed. I would not be surprised if tens of thousands of Palestinian civilians are killed by this attack on Gaza. Oh, it's also worth noting that in addition to all of this bombing and preparations for a ground attack, Israel has also enacted a complete embargo of all food, fuel, electricity, and water, although they to all 2.2 million Palestinians going into the Gaza Strip. Humanitarian aid can't get in. And so it's getting very dire. Just this morning, I saw that Israel they opened water back up for the southern Gaza Strip. So they didn't open it up for the north, where, in fact, the majority of the people live, or about half of the population lives. But they didn't do it for the north because they want to push everyone to the south. Yeah. So anyway, so what could happen next? This Israeli ground invasion, if it happens, is going to be the deadliest sort of event with regards to Palestine, and really, I think, for large swaths of the world, very, very quickly. We're talking, civilian casualties in the tens of thousands. This ethnic cleansing of Palestinians from Gaza and potentially the West Bank, that's another thing. The third thing that can happen is a wider conflagration between Israel and Hezbollah. Hezbollah is a Lebanese group. It was formed in the 1980s to resist the Israeli occupation of what was then South Lebanon. It has a very strong relationship with Iran. Iran is very Iran has provided support to both Hezbollah and Hamas, as well as various other groups in the Middle East. And the Iranian foreign minister has said as much, that, Israel needs to back off from what they're doing in Gaza, or maybe there's going to be a wider conflagration. He said that yesterday. There's a fear that Hezbollah is going to drastically escalate things against northern Israel. Every once in a while, you'll see them exchange artillery shellings or something like this. Israel will bomb something, but we haven't seen a major sort of war between Hezbollah and Israel since 2006. So there's a fear that that's going to happen. There's a fear that Iran could get a little bit more involved, and particularly with those 2 U.S. aircraft carriers off the coast of Israel. If we respond to Hezbollah's attacks or something, there's a fear, this could very quickly light up the entire Middle East.
This could be World War III, honestly.
Between sort of U.S.-backed sort of states and Israel, although I imagine many of the Arab states will try to stay out of it because they don't want to be on that side, and Iran on one side, and Iran and its sort of back groups on. So this could very quickly become a regional war, which is, that's the doomsday scenario, and one that I think everybody's trying to
petition
avoid.
Against.
Yes. Yeah. So what can we do about it? Really, what we've seen over the course of the last week is a massive outpouring of support for attempts to kind of reach a ceasefire or to de-escalate the situation, ideally to prevent an Israeli ground incursion into Gaza. So what I've been doing is I've been calling my representative, I've been calling the White House, I've been going to local protests, demanding at the very least, so the U.S. political establishment right now is so totally behind Israel. Criticism of any Israeli conduct right now is like, it's almost like post 9/11. You can't talk about it because of what happened, of what Hamas
They're defending
did.
themselves.
Yeah.
They're 9/11. Let them kill everyone.
Because of the horrific Hamas attacks, you can't criticize it. Several representatives have sort of come out and at the very least are circulating a letter calling on Israel to respect international law and its conduct towards the Palestinians, to respect the laws of war, and try to do that. I'm personally demanding the U.S. push for a ceasefire. Because if Israel goes into Gaza on a ground assault, and I understand the concerns about Hamas and this need to feel that you defend yourself and you have to exportate them. I understand that sentiment. I understand people who support that sentiment. if you go into Gaza with a massive ground invasion, this ethnic cleansing, it's going to happen. I'm so scared that that's going to happen. And so I am trying to do everything that I can to try to prevent that, because it would be the worst war crime or the worst atrocity that the United States has supported in at least a generation, if not more. So, I mean, like, I guess you have the Iraq War, so you have that. So yeah, but like, it would be very, very bad. And so that's what I'm doing, putting all of my energies towards, is to try to stop that and to de-escalate. There's been no attempts to get a hostage exchange deal. The Hamas, in its early statement, said the reason that it took these hostages was so that it could exchange them for the several thousand Palestinians currently being held in Israeli detention, some of them without any charge for an indefinite sort of amount of time. So there's been no attempt to sort of get a hostage exchange there. There's been no attempt to escalate. And it's unclear exactly if U.S. pressure on Israel is going to stop a ground invasion, but the level of support that we're providing materially, politically, just across the board, I couldn't live with myself if I didn't try to stop it. And I want your listeners to know what's going on, because this is on your dime. The United States government gives $3.8 billion in military aid to Israel every year. It provides constant political cover for Israeli actions at the United Nations. It has facilitated this, and it has underwritten it, and it's continuing to underwrite it. And if that doesn't move you, I don't know what will, because what we are seeing is a potential genocide.
I get it. Hamas attacked Israel.
Mm-hmm.
Israel retaliated.
Mm-hmm.
That I understand as a human being, because we typically react instead of respond.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas we should be responding, say, okay, well, why did they attack? How do we solve the problem? Instead of only caring about the problem, we should care about the solution. But now this far right Israeli government is basically saying we're going to scorch and salt the earth. So everyone get out of Gaza. We're going to level it. And the concern for the native Palestinians is Israel's just never going to give us our land back. And if so, they're just going to destroy all our hospitals, all our water supply, all our infrastructure. So it's basically the Stone Age. We have to build everything from nothing. And
it's worth noting that Israel has done this several times. The bombing thing, it's almost normalized. It's like, we know that they're going to blow up the fucking infrastructure and everything. Palestinians, Gazans can rebuild. The fear is that they're going, and you actually this last night you had an Israeli minister without portfolio. So it's worth noting that it's not like, he's necessarily sort of making the call here, but you had a minister say Gaza will need to be smaller after this happens. There will need to be a zone sort
like
of
a bigger DMZ.
Yeah, or I mean, they say like essentially there's going to need to be something like a buffer zone or something, or he says no settlements, but they're going to have to lose territory. Anyone who declares war on Israel has to lose territory, and then he's like, and Gaza is one of the most densely populated areas in the world, and so you don't get that without ethnically cleansing. So it's also worth noting, and I didn't mention this in my initial remarks, that the Israeli defense minister, who actually does have some control over how things work, has called Gazans or Palestinians human animals. And he says we're going to deal with them like human animals. He said that, earlier this week.
And that's the mindset you use to genocide, is dehumanizing the peoples.
Yes. So we've seen multiple sort of sentiments out of the Israeli leadership that what we're about to see is not going to be good. It's going to be very, very bad.
I understand that this is a very real fear. I thank you for your time to explain this to our viewers. You're saying we need to call our reps. That means our senators, our delegate.
Yeah.
So congressmen, senators.
Call the White House.
Is there just like Google, how do I call the White House? And the first number is the correct number.
So the White House has a comment line. It is notably only open between the Tuesday and Thursday between the hours of 11 a.m. and 3 p.m. I tried to call them on Friday, and they're like, sorry, it's not open. Call them.
So Tuesdays and Thursdays, what time?
Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday between 11 a.m. and 3 p.m. Those are the hours. They do. There's also an online version of that, but I don't think that that's necessarily as strong of a sort of statement. Just the calling. I think it put pressure because ultimately the U.S. has a lot of leverage here, and it's important to note that this isn't just between the Israelis and the Palestinians. That the United States, since at least 1967, 1973, has been the main underwriter of what Israel is doing in Palestine. It has been the main provider of weapons. It has been a major provider of financing. It has been the major political sponsor. What is happening in Palestine is not separate from what is happening in Ohio and Virginia, because we're backing this.
So we need to call our senators. We need to call our congresspeople. We need to call the White House between Tuesdays and Thursdays. And we, as the silent majority, need to speak up against this atrocity that's currently happening and about to continue to escalate.
I mean, ideally, if your listeners are sort of more on the fence, at the very least, call and demand that the U.S. apply pressure to Israel to respect the laws of war and international humanitarian law. Ideally, demand a push for a ceasefire. End this.
Yeah.
End this.
I'm pretty against murdering people. So I think a ceasefire and let's talk about this is probably the most reasonable solution that we, as an international community, can call for and should call for. I agree, ceasefires where it's at. Maybe don't enable genocide. Call the people who can call people about it. And that happens to be our senators, congresspeople, and the White House at large.
Yeah.
Nick, thank you so much for educating us about this. And I've been to protests with you, and you've been incredibly kind to me as a layperson who doesn't truly understand what's going on. So is there some place that people can go to see what you're doing? Is there a particular spot people can go to sign up for?
There are a number of resources that I can recommend. Adalah is putting out a lot of really good stuff. Decolonize Palestine is a really good resource to understand sort of the deeper nature of the conflict as well. For breaking news and everything with regards to that, I can send you some links to put sort of under this. But there's a lot of good resources.
And as an ex-military guy, I've been listening to Task and Purpose, and he's again been calling for ceasefire, calling for like, hey, maybe don't do genocide stuff.
Cool.
So I think it's important that we critically look at our news sources and make sure that it's not just echo chamber rhetoric stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So again, thank you for coming on, providing an expert point of view. And like I said, we're going to push to get this out Tuesday. It's Sunday now?
Cool.
So we'll get this out ASAP so that hopefully we can stop a genocide.
Hopefully.
At least. But
thank you so much for having me.
And call me if there's anything I can do to help you on
of course.
personal.
No. I very much appreciate it. I very, very much appreciate you giving the platform to try to do something to stop this. I really, really bottom of my heart. So thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us. This has been Aaron and Nick. Please call your senator, call your congresspeople. I'm going to be calling the White House on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays. Feel free to join me and just forward this episode, please. We normally don't ask for sharing on air, but please forward this so people know what's going on. And we, as the silent majority, can kind of speak up against what's potentially one of the most heinous things to happen in a very long time.
Thank you.
Nick, I'll talk to you later, brother.
Catch you later, man.
Bye.